वेलकम टू वीलर्न। वीलर्न में आपका स्वागत है। We are discussing research methods in business, session 12, interviewing. Topics to be covered are meaning of interviews, types of interviews, approaches to the interview, quality of interview, merits, demerits, interview techniques in business research, interview problem. Meanings of interview. Interviewing is one of the prominent methods of data collection. So it may be defined as a two-way systematic conversation between an investigator and an informant, and it is initiated for obtaining information which is relevant to a specific study. It just not only involves conversation but also learning from the respondent's gesture, facial expressions and his pauses. Interviewing requires a face-to-face contact or contact over telephone and calls for interviewing skills. It is done by using a structured schedule or an unstructured guide. Interviewing, it may be used either as a main method or as a supplementary one in studies of persons. Interviewing is only suitable in case of gathering information from illiterate or less educated respondents. So it is useful for collecting a wide range of data from factual demographic data, to highly personal and intimate information relating to a person's choice or his opinion, his attitudes, values, beliefs, past experiences. So when qualitative information is required, it is very necessary to draw out a very full and then interviewing is required. Where the area covered for the survey is compact, or when a significant number of qualified interviewers are available, personal interview is to a great extent feasible. Interview is often superior to other data gathering methods, so people are usually more willing to talk than to write. So once a report is established, even the confidential information may be obtained. It also permits probing into the context and reasons for answers to questions. Interviewing, when we talk about it, adds quality to the statistical information. It also enables the investigator to grasp the behavioral context of the data which is furnished by the respondents. When we talk about types of interviews could be classified as structured or directive interviews, unstructured or non-directive interviews, focused interviews, clinical interviews, and lastly the depth interview. When we talk about the structured interview or the directive interview, this is a kind of an interview which makes use of a very detailed standardized schedule. Now the same questions, they are put to all the respondents and in the same order to all the respondents only. Now each question which is asked, they are asked in the same way in each interview, which helps in promoting the measurement reliability. Now this type of interview, it is basically used for large scale formalized surveys. There are certain advantages when we talk about structured or directive interview. Now the data from one interview to the next one, they are easily comparable. Secondly, the recording and coding, they do not pose any problem, and there is greater precision which is achieved through this. And lastly, when we talk about, attention here is not diverted to extraneous or irrelevant factors, and it is time consuming conversation. There are certain limitations when we talk about structured or directive interview. Now this type of interview, it basically suffers from some limitations. Now firstly, it tends to lose the spontaneity of natural conversation because the questions are asked in a structured manner, in a robotic manner. Secondly, the way in which the interview is structured, it may be such that the respondents' views in that case are minimized, and the investigator's own biases regarding the problem under studies, they are inadvertently introduced. And lastly, the scope for the exploration here in this case is very limited. When we talk about unstructured or non-directive interviews, here these kind of interviews, they are the kind of interviews which are least structured. The interviewer, he encourages the respondents to talk freely about a given topic with a minimum of prompting or guidance. In this type of interview, basically, there is a detailed pre-planned schedule which is not used. Only a broad interview guide is used in this case. Now the interviewer, he avoids channeling the interview directions. Instead, what he does, he develops a very permissive atmosphere. Questions in case of unstructured or non-directive interviews, they are not standardized, and they are ordered, and they are not basically ordered in a particular manner. This interviewing technique is more useful in case of case studies rather than in surveys. So it is particularly useful in exploratory research where the lines of investigations, they are not clearly defined. It is also very useful for gathering information on sensitive topics. It furthermore provides opportunity to explore various aspects of the problem in an unrestricted manner. When we talk about the advantages of unstructured or non-directive interview, is that it can closely approximate the spontaneity of the natural conversation. It is less prone to interviewers' bias. It provides greater opportunity to explore the problem in an unrestricted manner. When we talk about the limitations of this method of interviewing, one of its major limitations when we talk about is that the data which is collected from one interview is basically not comparable to the data which is collected from the next interview. So it is not a suitable method for any kind of surveys. Now time may be wasted in unproductive conversation also, and by not focusing on one or another facets of a problem, the investigator, he may run the risk of being led up blindly ally. As there is no particular order or sequence when we are talking about unstructured interview, the classification of responses and furthermore the coding may require more time. This type of interview is basically informal interviewing calls where greater skills are required than formal survey interviews. When we talk about focused interview, This is a semi-structured interview when we talk, and here the investigator, he attempts to focus the discussion on the actual effects of a given experience to which the respondent is exposed. Now it takes place with the respondents known to have involved in a particular experience. What happens, the situation here in this case is analyzed prior to the interview. So the interview guide, it specifies topics which are relating to the research hypothesis which is used. Then the interview is basically focused on the subjective experience of the respondents. Those experiences could be his attitudes or his emotional responses when we talk about. So the focused interview permits the interviewer to obtain a very detail of personal reactions or specific emotions. When we talk about the merits of this method of interviewing is basically free from the inflexibility of the formal method. Yet it gives the interviewer a set format also and ensured adequate coverage of all the relevant topics. The respondent here is asked for certain information, then coupled with it he is also given plenty of opportunity to present his own views. The interviewer is also free to choose the sequence of the questions and determine the extent of the probing. When we talk about clinical interviews, it is somewhat similar to the focused interview, but yes, there are subtle differences. While the focus interview is concerned with the effects of specific experiences, clinical interview on the other hand is concerned with the broad underlying feelings or motivations or with the course of the individual's life experiences. The personal history interview, which is used in social casework or the prison administration, psychiatric clinics, and an individual life history research, they are the most common type of clinical interview. Now the specific aspect of the individual's life history which is to be covered by the interview, they are determined with reference to the purpose of the study, and the respondent is encouraged to talk freely about them. Lastly, when we talk about the depth interview, this is a very intensive and searching interview which is aimed at studying the respondent's opinion, emotions or convictions. Now this method, it requires much more training on interpersonal skills than structured interview. This is deliberately aimed to elicit the unconscious as well as the very extreme personal feelings and emotion. This method is generally a very lengthy procedure which is designed to encourage a free expression which could be effectively charged and information gathering. Therefore, it requires a lot of probing. Now the interviewer, he should totally avoid advising or showing disagreements. Of course, he should use encouraging expressions also. Now sometimes the interviewer has to face the problem of affection. When we talk about the problem of affection, the respondent may hide expressing affective feelings. Now the interviewer, he should handle such situation with a lot of care. When we talk about the approaches to interview, so interviewing as a method of data collection, it has certain features. Now the first feature is the participants that we talk about. So the interviewer and the respondent, they both are very strange to each other. So the investigator, he has to give him and get him introduced to the respondent in a very appropriate manner. The second is the relationship between the participant. It is a transitory one. So it has a fixed beginning and a termination point. So the interview proper is a fleeting or a monetary experience for them. Thirdly, interview is not a mere casual conversational exchange. So it is a conversation with a specific purpose, and the purpose is to obtain certain relevant information under the study. Then comes interview is a mode of obtaining verbal answers to questions put up verbally. Then comes interview is an interactionable process. The interaction between the interviewer and the respondents, they depend upon how they perceive each other. And interview is not a standardized process. When we say it is not a standardized process, like it is a very flexible psychological process. So the implication of the feature is that the interviewer, he cannot apply unvarying standardized technique because he is dealing with respondents with varying motives and diverse perceptions. When we talk about the qualities of interviews, the first quality is data availability. So the needed information, it should be available with the respondent. Second is the role perception. Now the respondent should understand that his role, and he should also know what is required of him. So he should know what is relevant and how complete it should be. The third is the interviewer should also know his role. He should establish a permissive atmosphere and then encourage frank and free conversation. He should not affect the interview situation through subjective attitude and any kind of argumentation. Lastly, the respondent's motivation. The respondent should be willing to respond and give the accurate answers. So this depends partly on the interviewer's approach and skill, and the interviewer has interest in it for the purpose of his research, but the respondent, he has no personal interest in it. Therefore, the interviewer should establish a friendly relationship with the respondent. Now when we talk about merits of the interview method, the very first great value of this method is that depth and detail of information can be obtained. Second is the interviewer, he can do more to improve the percentage of responses and the quality of information received than other methods. So he can make note of the conditions of the interview situations likewise. Thirdly, the interviewer, he can gather other supplemental informations. Information when we talk about information about the economic level or the living conditions through observations of the respondent's environment. Fourthly, the interviewer, he can use special scoring devices. These devices could be visual materials and the like in order to improve the quality of the interviewing. Fifth, if we talk about the accuracy and the dependability of the answers given by the respondent, it can be checked by the observation and further probing. Lastly, interview is very flexible and adaptable to the individual situation. Even more, when we talk about control can be exercised over the interview situations. Now there are demerits of interview. The biggest drawback of interview is that it is costly in terms of both money and time. Secondly, the interview results, they are often adversely affected by the interviewer's mood or his personal prejudices. Thirdly, there are certain types of personal and financial information which the respondent may refuse to give in a face-to-face interview. Fourthly, the interview, it poses the problem of recording information which is obtained from the respondent, And lastly, interview, it calls for highly interviewers and people who are highly skilled. So the availability of such person is basically limited. When we talk about the interviewing techniques, so the first technique is preparation. So when we talk about preparation, any interviewing, it requires some pre-planning and preparation. Second is the introduction stage. So the investigator is a stranger to the respondent, so he is required to give a very proper introduction to each of his respondents. Then come developing rapport. So before he starts the interview research, he should first establish a very friendly relationship with the respondents. This helps in giving and acquiring a more accurate information. Then comes carrying the interview forward. Once the rapport is established, the technical task of asking the question begins. Right? Then come additional settings. So when we talk about additional setting, in the case of any qualitative interviews which are involving longer durations, so one single sitting will not be possible. So an interviewer, he must ensure additional settings as well. Then comes recording the interview. It is very important to record the responses of each response from the respondent. Seventh is closing the interview. Once the interview is over, the investigator, he must take leave off from the respondent and thanking him in a very friendly manner. Lastly is the editing. So at the close of the interviewer must edit the schedule to check that whatever he has asked and whether all the questions were asked or not and whether all were recorded or not. When we talk about interviewing problems, first is inadequate response. So yes, the respondent may not give the required and the desired response. Second is the interviewer's bias himself. So interviewer himself is an important cause for a response bias. He may resort to cheating or cooking up data while without actually interviewing the person. Then come non-responses. Right? Non-responsing, it refers to a failure to obtain responses from some of the sample. Then comes non-availability. Non-availability is a situation where some respondents are not available at their home. Refusal is a situation where some person, they refuse to furnish information because they are ill-disposed or approached at a wrong time. Then comes inaccessibility. When we talk about inaccessibility, there are some respondents who are inaccessible. Some may not be found due to migration or for other reasons. Now there are two exercises. First, what do you mean by telephone interview and what is focused interview? Thank you and have a nice day. Keep learning and relearning.